The rain didn't care that it was the worst possible night for the roof of the Dusty Spur Saloon to finally give out. It came down in sheets so thick that Marisol Vega couldn't see the end of Main Street from the doorway, couldn't see the hitchin' post she'd tied her horse to not 20 minutes ago, couldn't see much of anything except the curtain of dark water and the occasional white crack of lightning splitting the Wyoming sky wide open like a fault line in the earth itself. The thunder that followed wasn't a rumble. It was a declaration. Something is ending tonight, it seemed to say. Something is beginning. She was 23 years old, soaked through to the bone, and absolutely furious about it. "Close the door, Mari, you're letting in the cold," hollered Bet from behind the bar, not looking up from the glass she was polishing, a gesture so performative in a place this dusty that Marisol had always found it quietly hilarious. Bet polished glasses the way some people prayed, habitually, without much expectation of result. Marisol pulled the door shut and pushed her dripping dark hair back from her forehead. The Dusty Spur was half full, which on a Tuesday in Harlow Creek, Wyoming, was actually a respectable showing. 4 ranch hands from the Callaway spread were playing cards in the corner. Old Hector Munoz was asleep at his usual table with his hat over his face, his breathing so deep, and even it was almost musical. 2 women Marisol vaguely recognized from the new textile outfit over on Route 9 were nursing glasses of red wine and talking in low, intense voices. The fire in the stone hearth was doing the Lord's work, pushing warmth into every corner, making the lantern light golden and forgiving. It was the kind of night that felt sealed off from the rest of the world. And then the door behind her swung open again, and everything changed. He came in the way weather comes in all at once, with no warning and no apology for the disruption. He was tall, broad through the shoulders in a way that had nothing to do with padding and everything to do with years of actual physical work. His coat was oil-slicked and dark with rain, his hat pulled low, his boots leaving wet prints across Bet's recently swept floor. He moved with the kind of deliberate, unhurried certainty that Marisol associated with men, who had either nothing to prove or everything to hide. He stopped just inside the door and looked around the room. When his eyes found hers dark, still, unreadable as deep water, he didn't look away. Neither did she. And Marisol Vega, who had grown up on a failing cattle ranch, who had learned to fix fences and balance ledgers, and read weather in the color of clouds before she'd learned to braid her own hair, who had kissed exactly 2 people in her 23 years and felt precisely nothing both times. Marisol Vega felt something shift in her chest like a lock turning. She told herself it was just the cold. She would spend the next 3 weeks learning how wrong she was. His name, she learned approximately 40 minutes later, was Callum Reed. She learned it the way you learn most things in a small-town saloon during a rainstorm, by proximity and by accident. He'd settled at the bar 2 stools down from where she'd claimed her usual spot, ordered whiskey neat from Bet with a voice so low, and unhurried it seemed to belong to a different, slower era, and then sat there with the particular stillness of a man who was either at complete peace with himself or carrying something so heavy he'd stopped fighting it. Marisol had her own drink, beer, cold, the same thing she always ordered because she liked consistency and because the Dusty Spurs beer was genuinely good and she was not staring at him. She was absolutely not staring at him. She was looking at the middle distance in the general direction of the bottles lined up behind the bar. And if that middle distance happened to occasionally include his reflection in the old mirror Bet had hung back there sometime in the previous century, that was purely coincidental. "You're dripping on my stool," she said, because she couldn't help herself. It was true. The runoff from his coat was creating a small, spreading puddle that was definitely migrating toward her left boot. He looked down, then he looked at her. The corners of his mouth did something subtle, something that was technically not a smile but contained all the raw material of one. "Apologize for that," he said. His voice had gravel in it, and something else underneath the gravel, an accent that had been mostly worn smooth but not entirely. Scottish, maybe, or Northern English. Something old world that had been living in America long enough to feel at home but not long enough to fully disappear. "You could move your coat," she pointed out. "Could," he agreed and didn't move. She looked at him again, more directly this time. He was looking at her with the same direct, uncomplicated attention, like looking at another person wasn't something that required deflection or performance. It was disarming in a way that made her slightly annoyed, because she prided herself on being the least flustered person in any given room. "Callum Reed," he said, extending one hand. It was a working hand. Calloused, capable, with the particular set of someone who'd spent years doing something physically demanding and specific. "Marisol Vega," she shook it once firm, "you passing through or staying?" "Staying," he said, "for a while." "Where?" The corner of his mouth did the thing again. "Does it matter?" "In a town of 800 people," she said, "everything matters." He considered this with what seemed like genuine respect. Fair enough. He picked up his whiskey and turned slightly on his stool to face her more directly. "I've taken a lease on the old Hargrove property, out on Route 12. Know it." She knew it. Everyone knew it. The Hargrove property was 900 acres of the finest grazing land in Sweetwater County, sitting vacant for 3 years since old Douglas Hargrove had died without heirs, and the estate had wound its way through a labyrinth of lawyers and distant relations, and eventually ended up available for lease at a price that had made every rancher in the county do some very complicated math and come up short. The kind of price that required real money, not working ranch money. Different money. She looked at his coat again, all slicked but well made. His boots, she realized now, were not the boots of a man counting every dollar. They were hand-tooled dark leather, the kind of boots you didn't see in a place like Harlow Creek because nobody in Harlow Creek could afford them. "Huh," she said. "Huh," he repeated. "Nothing." She took a sip of her beer. "That's a lot of land for one person." "I'm not one person," he said. "I've got a crew coming, 6 men, good ones." He paused. "And I'm not just leasing, I'm hoping to buy eventually if the terms work out." Marisol set her beer down very carefully. "Douglas Hargrove's land. If everything goes the way I'm hopping." She thought about the Vega Ranch, 40 acres and shrinking. She thought about her father's hands, which had been shaking lately, not from cold or age, but from something the doctor in Casper had used long words to describe. She thought about the feed bills and the vet bills and the loan payment due at the end of the month, and the end of the month after that. She thought about 900 acres of the finest grazing land in Sweetwater County, sitting right next to her family's struggling 40. She thought about what a man with real money and 900 acres could mean for the landscape of this valley. "Welcome to Harlow Creek, then," she said, and her voice was perfectly even. "Hope you find what you're looking for." She didn't say, "I hope it doesn't swallow us whole." She finished her beer, put money on the bar, and went home through the rain. She dreamed about dark water that night, about standing on a shore and looking out at something she couldn't name, something deep and still and watching. She woke up before sunrise with her heart beating strangely and lay in the dark listening to the rain tapping against the tin roof of the ranch house, slower now, winding down. Just a stranger, she told herself, just a man passing through. She'd been wrong about things before. She was wrong about this one too. She saw him again 4 days later, and she wasn't looking for him. That was the honest truth, the part she could stand behind without flinching. She was out at the eastern fence line at 6 in the morning because 3 sections of wire had come loose in the storm and her father's hands were shaking too badly to manage the wire stretcher, and because paying someone to do it would cost money they didn't have, and because Marisol had been fixing fences since she was old enough to hold a pair of pliers. The sky was that particular shade of early blue that existed only in the first hour after dawn, pale, luminous, impossibly clean, and the wet grass sparkled, and the air smelled of cedar and fresh earth, and the faint, distant sweetness of the creek running high from the rain. She heard his horse before she saw him. A heavy, rhythmic sound from the other side of the fence line, the property line that separated Vega land from what was now, apparently, Reed territory. The horse was a big roan, dark red in the early light, moving with easy confidence through the wet grass. Its rider sat it the way good horsemen sit horses, not stiff, not performing, just part of the animal's movement, natural as breathing. He pulled up about 10 feet from where she was kneeling in the mud, working the second fence post back into the ground with a mallet she'd been using for 15 years and fully intended to use until it fell apart. "Morning," he said. She looked up. The light was behind him, making his outline sharp and his face slightly shadowed, and she had a strange moment of pure sensation, just the image of him, the roan horse, the blue sky, the wet grass, before her brain reassembled itself and she said, "Morning," back. "Fence trouble," he nodded at the wire she was working with. "Storm damage," she went back to the post, "nothing I can't handle." She heard rather than saw him dismount, the creak of leather, the soft landing of boots in wet grass. And then he was on his knee beside her in the mud, no invitation offered or requested, and he had hold of the wire stretcher with both hands. "Other side," he said, as if this were obvious. She looked at him. He looked at the fence. She considered telling him that she didn't need help, that she'd been doing this longer than he'd probably been in Wyoming, that she was perfectly capable of managing her own fence line. All of that was true. But the morning was cold and her knees were soaked and the wire really did go easier with two people. And there was something about the straightforward, uncomplicating way he'd simply gotten down and helped, no fanfare, no performance of generosity, just a practical person seeing a practical problem, that she found, against her better judgment, disarming. She moved to the other side and held the post. They worked in silence for a few minutes. Comfortable silence, the kind that should have taken weeks to develop between strangers but seemed to arrive, fully formed, between them. The birds were getting louder as the sun rose. The creek noise was constant underneath everything else. His movements were economical and efficient. He knew what he was doing with wire and tools, which told her something. "You've done this before," she said. "Grew up on a farm," he said. "Scotland, small, very different from this." He looked out at the horizon, at the vast open sweep of the Wyoming plain, the Laramie Range dark blue in the distance. "Very different from this," he said again, quieter, and she couldn't tell if that was good or bad. "How long have you been in the States?" 10 years. He worked the wire tight. "Started in Montana, worked my way south and east, landed in Wyoming 3 years ago and something about it." He paused. The silence stretched in a way that felt intentional. Something about it said stay. She understood that. She'd had offers to leave, a scholarship to the University of Wyoming that she'd deferred once and then not taken, a relationship with a man from Denver who'd wanted her to come back with him, a cousin in Albuquerque who kept saying there was work and opportunity and a life without mud and early mornings and the constant arithmetic of survival. And every time she tried to imagine it, really imagine it, her life somewhere else, she'd felt something inside her resist so absolutely it was almost physical. "The land does that," she said. He looked at her then properly, and she had the feeling again of being looked at by someone who wasn't performing the act of looking, who was genuinely seeing. It was startling. It was also, she admitted privately, not entirely unpleasant. "Your family's been here a while?" he asked. 3 generations, she said. "My grandfather came up from New Mexico in the 40s, bought the land when it was worth buying, built the house with his own hands." She straightened up, rolled her shoulders. 40 acres now. Used to be 90, but she stopped. She wasn't going to tell a stranger about the years when things got tight, the parcels sold off, the math that never quite worked. "But the land stays," he said, finishing her sentence, not in the intrusive way people sometimes did, but as if he simply understood. The land stays, she agreed. They moved to the third section of fence. It took them another 20 minutes to finish the work. When it was done, they stood up and looked at the repaired line, and there was a small, unspoken satisfaction in it, the kind that comes from looking at something fixed that was broken. Marisol brushed the mud from her knees. He pulled off his work gloves and turned them in his hands. "You want coffee," she said before she decided to say it. He looked at her. "If it's no trouble." "I wouldn't offer if it were," she said, and walked back toward the ranch house, not waiting to see if he followed. He followed. The ranch house was small and worn, and absolutely clean in the way of houses lived in by people who didn't have much, but maintained what they had with fierce dignity. The kitchen was warm, the old wood stove still putting out heat from the morning fire. There were herbs hanging to dry from the low beam over the window. A calendar on the wall with dates marked in her father's handwriting. Photographs on the sideboard, her grandfather young and serious, her mother laughing at something outside the frame, Marisol herself at maybe 10 years old on a horse twice her size, looking terrified and delighted in equal measure. Callum Reed stood in the doorway and looked at those photographs with the quiet attention she was beginning to recognize as characteristic. "That you?" he asked, nodding at the 10-year-old. "Unfortunately," she said, spooning coffee. "You look exactly the same." She turned and looked at him. He was completely serious. Something warm moved through her chest, quick and unbidden, and she turned back to the stove and focused very intently on the coffee pot. "Sit down," she said. "It'll be 5 minutes." He sat at the kitchen table without fuss, pushed his hat back, and looked out the window at the morning. He was comfortable in other people's spaces in the way of someone who grew up in a place where neighbors were neighbors, and the line between yours and mine was less rigid than it became in cities. She liked that. She was noting things she liked about him, which she recognized as a process with a trajectory she should probably be more careful about. She was not being careful about it. She put 2 mugs on the table and sat across from him. The coffee was strong and black, and he drank it without adding anything, which she counted as a point in his favor. They talked about the land, the specific challenges of Wyoming grazing, the water rights question that was a permanent low-level tension in the county, the way the winters came and didn't let go, about horses, about the particular quality of the light here in the hour before noon, when everything had a clarity and a weight that felt almost sacred. She didn't talk about her father's health. She didn't talk about the money. He didn't ask, which was either sensitivity or discretion, and either way she appreciated it. He left an hour later, rising from the table with the same easy purposefulness he seemed to do everything with, thanking her for the coffee in a way that was simple and genuine and didn't overdo it. At the door he paused and looked back. "I'm going to need to learn the creek routes," he said, "the ones that cross the county line for water access. Would you—" He stopped, reconsidered. "Never mind, I can figure it out on my own." "Thursday morning," she said. "I do the east boundary check on Thursdays. You can ride along if you like." He looked at her. Something behind his eyes was warm and precise, like a lamp turned to just the right level. "Thursday then," he said. She watched him ride back across the property line on his big roan horse, and she stood in the doorway for a moment longer than was strictly necessary after he'd gone, listening to the sound of the creek and the birds, and the morning going about its business. Careful, she told herself. She went to work. Thursday came with a sky like hammered silver and a wind that had attitude but no real conviction, pushing at them from the northwest and then backing off, as if making a point without quite committing to an argument. Marisol had 2 horses ready when Callum arrived at the property line at 7:30, her own bay mare, Sita, and the smaller roan gelding, Peso, that she sometimes leased out to the feed store in town for deliveries when cash was tight. He arrived on his own horse again, the big dark roan she now knew was named Bard, which she found quietly interesting, a Scottish farmer's son who named his horse after a poet. He saw the gelding and understood without being told that she'd offered it as an alternative to the animal he'd brought. "I'll keep Bard," he said, "but thank you for thinking of it. I wasn't sure how much trail riding you'd done." "Enough," a pause, "probably more than you'd expect." She mounted Sita and headed east. He fell in beside her, and they moved out across the damp grass in a silence that had become, over the space of 2 meetings and a shared cup of coffee, somehow characteristic of them, comfortable before it should have been, easy in a way that she kept trying to find reasons to be suspicious of. The creek route was a 4-mile loop along Sweetwater Creek, which ran along the eastern boundary of both properties before cutting northeast toward the open range. It was one of Marisol's favorite stretches of land. The way the willows leaned over the water, yellow-green at this time of year. The way the creek itself moved with the particular music of mountain water, clear and quick over smooth stones. She'd ridden this route hundreds of times in every season, and it never entirely stopped surprising her. She showed him the access points, where the creek ran shallow enough to cross, where the banks were solid and where they could deceive you, where the water table sat close enough to the surface that you'd get bogging in a wet season. Practical information, the kind that took years to accumulate, that she was giving him freely because it was what a neighbor did. She watched him absorb it without writing anything down, which meant he was storing it, building his own map of the land the way ranchers did, spatially, experientially in the body rather than on paper. "You've got water rights up to the second bend?" he asked at one point, studying the creek where it curved east. "Contested," she said. "The Hargrove estate never finalized the line, which means," she paused. "Which means that's something we'll need to work out," he said. He looked at her. "I'd rather work it out as neighbors than as litigants." She assessed him. He meant it. There was a directness to him that was, she was finding, one of his consistent qualities. He said what he meant, without evasion, without the kind of social padding that people put around difficult things to make them easier to say and harder to understand. It was refreshing and slightly unnerving in equal measure. "So would I," she said. "We can talk to the county clerk, get the original survey on record." He nodded. They rode on. It was at the third access point, where the willows made a green canopy over the water and the light came through in long, angled pieces, turning everything gold and dappled, that she asked him the question she'd been holding for 3 days. "Why Harlow Creek?" He looked at her. "Specifically," she said, "you said you moved around. Montana, south and east. There's good land in a dozen counties between there and here. Why this one?" He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. Bard picked his way carefully down the bank to drink. Sita followed. They sat their horses at the creek's edge, watching the water. "I came through here once," he said finally. 3 years ago in autumn, just passing through. It was late afternoon and the light was," he stopped, started again. "I pulled over on Route 12 and I sat there for maybe 20 minutes just looking at the valley. And I thought," another pause, and she got the impression this was a man who chose words carefully because he meant every one of them. "I thought that I'd been looking for something for a very long time, and I wasn't certain what it was. But it was possible that, whatever it was, lived here." The creek moved. The willows stirred. A hawk turned in a slow circle high above them. "And did you find it?" she asked. Her voice was very level. He looked at her. The light came through the willows and touched the side of his face, and she saw, for the first time, how tired he looked underneath the competence and the stillness. Not exhausted, not defeated, but the particular tiredness of someone who has been carrying something alone for a long time and has almost gotten used to the weight of it. "I don't know yet," he said. The silence between them had a texture after that, like fabric just before it catches the light at a particular angle and you see what it's really made of. She looked away first. "We should check the north cutoff before noon," she said. "The banks are narrow up there and I want to see if the storm shifted anything." "Lead the way," he said. She did, and she did not think about the way he'd looked at her when he said, "I don't know yet." She did not think about it even once. She thought about it approximately 40 times before she fell asleep that night. Harlow Creek was not a large town, and it had the appetite for information characteristic of all small places. Insatiable, thorough, and rarely accurate in its specifics, though often correct in its general impressions. Within 2 weeks of Callum Reed's arrival, the town had established the following facts to its satisfaction. He was Scottish. He had money, real money, though nobody could agree on where it came from. There were theories involving oil, tech, inherited estates, a successful cattle operation in Montana, a poker game of legendary proportions. He'd hired 6 men from out of county, all of whom were quiet, competent, and disinclined to socialize, which the town found both sensible and mildly insulting. He was renovating the Hargrove farmhouse, which had sat empty long enough to develop genuine structural ambitions. He drove a truck that cost more than most of the houses on Cedar Street. The most interesting fact, carefully noted and widely discussed, was that he'd been seen twice at the Vega property. Once at the fence line and once riding out from the east side, which meant he'd been on Vega land itself, which meant Marisol Vega had invited him, which meant. "Don't," Marisol said, on a Wednesday afternoon when she stopped into me's diner for coffee and found me herself, Dee Calloway, and a woman named Roberta from the textile shop all looking at her with expressions that were technically neutral but working very hard. "I didn't say anything," me said. "You were about to." "I was about to ask if you wanted the good coffee or the regular." "They're the same coffee, me." "One of them I say is good," me said, pouring. "It tastes better." Marisol sat at the counter and wrapped her hands around the mug. The diner was warm and smelled of pie, and it was, despite everything, one of her favorite places in town, the kind of place where the linoleum was worn from decades of feet, and the booths had been recovered so many times the vinyl was a different color in every corner, and none of it mattered because the food was real, and the people were mostly genuine, and you could sit here and feel the solid, ordinary reality of your life like ballast. "He helped me fix a fence," she said. "We rode the creek boundary. He's a new landowner. It's called being a neighbor," said Dee Calloway, which was not a word but contained volumes. "His name is Callum Reed," Roberta said, in the tone of someone deploying information they've been waiting to deploy. "I looked it up. There's a Reed Agricultural Holdings in Scotland, based in Inverness, second largest private landholding in the Highlands. He's the son." She paused for effect. "The only son." The diner was quiet. Marisol set down her mug. "You looked him up," she said. "Everybody looked him up," me said reasonably. Marisol thought about the hand-tooled boots, the truck, the lease price for 900 acres, the way he moved through space as if the question of resources had simply never been a source of anxiety. She thought about him kneeling in the mud at her fence line, with a wire stretcher in his bare hands. "That doesn't change anything," she said, more to herself than to the women around her. "Of course not," me agreed, refilling her mug. "Not a thing." She told herself it didn't change anything for approximately 4 more days before she admitted privately that it changed something. Not in the way that mattered, not in the practical sense of how she treated him or what she thought of him, but in the sense of a puzzle piece suddenly fitting, a context clicking into place. The careful quality of his attention made more sense now. People who had grown up with the anxiety of money, with the constant calculation of it, tended to pay attention differently than people who hadn't. He paid attention the way someone did, who'd learned early that the world was larger and more interesting than any single position in it. She found that, if anything, she liked him slightly better for it. The problem, and she was trying to be honest with herself about the fact that there was a problem, was that she liked him in general rather a lot, and it was getting specific. She liked the way he said her name, which he'd started doing sometimes in place of a greeting, just Marisol, as a kind of opening, as if her name were itself a complete sentence. She liked the way he listened without filling silences, without offering opinions before they were formed. She liked the small, precise humor that appeared occasionally in his expression without quite making it to his face. She liked that he knew how to work. She liked his hands. She acknowledged to the dark of her bedroom one night around 2 in the morning, in trouble. The invitation happened entirely by accident, which was something Marisol chose to believe for a long time afterward. Her father, Eduardo Vega, was 62 years old and had the disposition of a man who considered hospitality a moral obligation rather than a social gesture. He'd been asking about the new neighbor since the second day. What's he like? What's his land plan? Has he got family? Does he eat? And when he happened to be at the window on a Saturday afternoon, when Callum rode past on the boundary trail, and Marisol was in the yard mending tack, Eduardo opened the window and called out an invitation to dinner before Marisol even registered what was happening. "Papa," she said, when Callum had accepted and ridden on with a nod and a small smile that she chose not to examine. "What?" Eduardo looked entirely innocent. "Nothing," she said. She went back to the tack. Her hands were very steady. She was very fine. He arrived at 6 with a bottle of wine that cost more than the weekly grocery run, and a jar of something amber and handmade that turned out to be heather honey from a Scottish farm he still had a relationship with, which her father found so genuinely interesting that they ended up in a 20-minute conversation about Scottish moorland that Marisol participated in not at all. Because she was making herself busy in the kitchen in a way that was absolutely purposeful, and not at all an excuse to stand with her back to the room and breathe normally. The kitchen was her territory and she was good in it, the way she was good at most practical things, with the competence that came from years of doing something out of necessity until it became genuine mastery. She'd made a lamb stew that her grandmother had taught her and roasted vegetables from the small winter garden and cornbread because there was always cornbread. Simple food, good food, the kind of food that meant something. When she came to the table with the stew pot, Callum stood up. It was instinctive, unperformed, the kind of gesture so habitual it wasn't a gesture anymore, just a reflex of a particular upbringing. She noted it and sat down and did not say anything about it. It was good. That was the honest accounting. Eduardo was in one of his best moods, sharp and funny and full of stories about the valley, its history, its eccentricities, the long cast of characters who'd moved through it and left their mark. He talked about Marisol's grandfather with the reverence that second-generation people carry for their parents' courage, and about her mother, Carmen, who died when Marisol was 15, with a grief that had been lived with for so long it had become something else, not gone, not buried, but integrated, part of the way he understood the world. Callum listened to all of it with the quality of attention Marisol had come to think of as his specific gift. He didn't perform interest. He was interested. He asked questions that showed he'd heard everything that came before them. He talked about his own father, a man named Alastair, serious and exacting and difficult in the way of men who love very much but don't know how to say so simply, with a measured affection that told her they had something, these two men, that wasn't easy but was real. At some point the table had emptied of food and filled with the comfortable debris of a meal that had gone long wine glasses, the honey jar, Eduardo's reading glasses that he'd put on to look at something Callum had shown him on his phone and then forgotten to take off. The fire was low. The night outside was clear and cold and full of stars. Eduardo excused himself with the transparent tact of a man executing a deliberate exit. The kitchen was quiet. "Your father is remarkable," Callum said, turning his wine glass slowly. "He is," she agreed. "Don't tell him, he's already insufferable." The corner of his mouth moved. "I don't think he knows he's doing it." "That's what makes it worse." She looked at the fire. "He liked you," she added, because it was true and because her father's good opinion was not a careless thing, and she thought Callum should know it had been extended. He was quiet for a moment. "I'm glad." The fire crackled. Outside, a night bird. The distant sound of the creek always there, always underneath everything. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yes." "Why are you here alone?" She said it directly, the way she did things without wrapping it up. "A man with your—" She paused, choosing the word carefully. "Resources, building something this size in the middle of Wyoming. Alone. There's no—" She stopped again. "No one waiting somewhere else," he said. "I wasn't going to say it like that." "But that's what you mean." She met his eyes. "Yes." He looked at his wine glass, at the fire, then at her, and there was something in his face that was the most unguarded she'd seen from him. A layer of the careful, controlled surface gone for just a moment, and underneath it something that was tired and real and private. "There was someone," he said, "for a long time, and then there wasn't, and I had to—" He stopped, restarted. "I had to figure out what I was building toward when I wasn't building towards someone, what it was for." Another pause. "I don't think I've finished figuring that out." She didn't say anything. She let it sit the way it deserved to sit. "And you?" he asked. And his voice was quiet and direct and not invasive, the question of someone genuinely interested in the answer, willing to take whatever she chose to give. "I've been building toward keeping this," she said, gesturing generally at the house, the land, her father. "For a long time that was enough. For a long time it was enough." She heard the verb tense she'd used and didn't correct it. He heard it too. She could tell by the small, precise change in his expression. "And now?" he asked. She looked at the fire for a long moment. "Now," she said carefully, "I'm not entirely certain." The silence after that had its own weight and texture and temperature. It sat between them like a third presence, like something alive. She stood up and started clearing the table, because she needed to move, and he stood up to help, because of course he did. And they worked together in the small kitchen in a silence that was not uncomfortable, but was charged with something she didn't know what to do with yet. Something she'd need more time and more space to understand. He left at 9:30, thanked her father, thanked her simply and sincerely, and walked out into the cold, clear night. She stood at the kitchen window and watched his truck's lights move down the long drive and turn onto Route 12. Her father appeared beside her with 2 mugs of tea. He handed her one without comment. "Papa," she said. "Oh, don't." "I haven't said a word." He sipped his tea. "He fixed your fence." "He helped fix my fence, once." "A man who helps fix a fence," Eduardo said philosophically, "when nobody asked him to, in the mud, in the cold, that's not nothing, Mija." She drank her tea and did not answer. He was not wrong. She pulled back after that dinner. She would examine this decision later, from different angles, with varying degrees of fairness to herself, and she would conclude that it was both understandable and somewhat cowardly, and exactly the kind of thing she did when something started to feel real enough to be dangerous. She was good at proximity. She was not good at what proximity sometimes became. The dinner had been too easy, too warm, too much like something she wanted in a way that made her cautious in the way of people who have learned that wanting things too directly is a form of vulnerability. So she was busy, genuinely busy in the way that ranch life provided if you let it. There was always a reason to be somewhere else, always something that needed doing, always the practical machinery of survival to tend to. Her father's next appointment with the specialist in Casper, the year-end ledger, which she worked on at the kitchen table late into the night with a calculator and a quiet, focused dread that was becoming familiar. A fence dispute with the Callaway property on the west side that required 2 meetings and a surveyor and a great deal of diplomacy. She saw Callum at the County Water Board meeting on a Tuesday evening in the second week of December, which she'd almost not attended, and was now sitting 3 rows behind him in the Harlow Creek Community Center's permanently underheated meeting room. He was there in a professional capacity, The water rights question along the creek boundary was a real issue, one that affected both properties, and he'd come prepared, with maps and documentation and the kind of organized competence that made the water board, who were accustomed to landowners arriving with grievances and no paperwork, visibly grateful. He hadn't seen her come in. She watched him from 3 rows back and felt the particular, uncomfortable awareness of someone who has been trying not to think about a person and is now watching them be, quietly and without any apparent effort, exactly as she remembered. He turned at some point during the proceedings, scanning the room for something, and his eyes found hers. He held her gaze for a beat that she felt in the center of her chest. Then he turned back to the board. Afterward, in the parking lot, he caught up with her. "You've been busy," he said. He was not accusing her. He was simply noting a fact the way he noted facts. "It's a busy season," she said. He looked at her. In the cold, his breath made small clouds, and the parking lot lights turned everything amber and sharp. He was wearing his coat and his hat, and he looked like exactly what he was, a man who belonged in this landscape, who had chosen it the way you chose something you intended to keep. "I'm not going to push," he said. "That's not," he paused, and she recognized the pause, the choosing of words. "That's not what I want from you." "What do you want?" she said, before she decided to say it. He was quiet for a moment. The cold air between them was still. "I want to be your neighbor," he said, "properly, and then," he stopped. "And then whatever else happens or doesn't, I'd rather have that than nothing." She looked at him. She looked at the sky above him, at the winter stars brittle and specific in the cold. She looked back at him. "I'll be at the creek boundary Friday morning," she said. "The water board's going to want a joint survey before they'll settle the rights question. It makes sense to do it before the hard freeze." Something in his expression shifted, slightly, in a way that was quiet and warm and private. "Friday," he said. "Yes." She drove home with the heater on full, and her hands very steady on the wheel, and her heart doing something she was choosing not to analyze. The woman's name was Fiona Whitmore, and she arrived in Harlow Creek on a Thursday in the 3rd week of December in a city car that was inappropriate for the roads, dressed in clothes that were beautiful and completely impractical, and she went directly to the Hargrove property, which the town noted with considerable interest. "Marisol learned about it from me, which was how you learned most things." "Friend of his, apparently," me said, refilling Marisol's coffee with the practiced efficiency of someone delivering information alongside a service. "She's staying at the Hargrove house. Came with 2 suitcases." "That's fine," Marisol said. "Of course it is," me said. "Very fine." "Me. She's very pretty." "I'm sure she is." She was. Marisol saw her on Friday morning, which she'd been specifically not dreading. A tall, auburn-haired woman in an expensive quilted jacket, standing at the fence line next to Callum when Marisol rode up on Sita. And something in Marisol's chest did something quick and unpleasant that she identified and immediately did not like identifying. Callum made introductions with the easy courtesy of someone who saw no complexity in the situation. "Marisol Vega, this is Fiona Whitmore. Fiona and I grew up together. She's visiting for a week." Fiona had the clear, confident eyes of someone accustomed to being looked at and not feeling threatened by it. She was warm, straightforwardly so, extending her hand and saying she'd heard about Marisol from Callum with a directness that was either artless or very skilled. "All good things, I hope," Marisol said, and her voice was perfectly even. "He said you knew the land better than anyone in the county," Fiona said. "He said," she glanced at Callum, and something in that glance was complicated in a way Marisol filed without looking at directly. "He said you were the most capable person he'd met since he got here." Marisol looked at Callum. He was looking at the creek. "Let's get started," she said. "We've got about 3 hours before the light goes." She was professional and thorough, and utterly fine about it for the entire duration of the survey. She noted reference points, took measurements, explained the water table situation with clarity, and without editorializing, answered Callum's questions and Fiona's more general questions about the region with equal patience. She was, in the mirror of her own self-assessment, completely fine. She rode home at noon and sat in the kitchen and drank a glass of water and acknowledged, with the fairness she tried to apply to herself even when it was inconvenient, that she was jealous. It was clarifying, in the way that clarity sometimes arrived via discomfort. She was jealous not in a dramatic, overwrought way, but in the small, specific way of someone who has realized they want something they haven't admitted to wanting, the jealousy of recognition. It told her something she'd been circling around for weeks, something she'd been trying to approach sideways, because approaching it directly was too much like admitting to a need she wasn't sure how to carry. She allowed herself to simply say it, there in the empty kitchen, to the ordinary winter light coming through the window. She wanted what had been building between them over the past weeks to continue building. She wanted the fence line mornings and the creek rides and the kitchen table silences. She wanted more of the careful, real attention of him. She wanted, specifically, for a woman named Fiona Whitmore to not be staying in his house for a week, which was a petty and human and completely unmanageable feeling. She drank her water, she looked at the calendar, she went back to work. Fiona left on a Wednesday, and on Thursday morning Callum was at the Vega fence line again. He had no practical reason to be there. The survey was complete. The water board meeting wasn't until the following week. There was nothing that needed fixing. He was simply there at the fence line at 7 in the morning with 2 cups of coffee in a thermos and his hat pushed back on his head in the way it went when he was thinking about something. Marisol saw him from the barn and stood there for a moment with a bucket in each hand, deciding. Then she set the buckets down and walked over. He poured coffee without being asked. The thermos produced 2 cups with neat efficiency and handed her one. They stood at the fence in the cold morning and looked at the land. She went home, she said. She did. Was it good to have her here? He thought about it, which was what he did. He didn't give fast answers to real questions. It was good to see her, he said. Fiona and I, he paused. There was something between us a long time ago. It didn't work, but the friendship survived it, which is its own kind of miracle. He looked at his coffee cup. She came partly to see me and partly to assess the situation. Marisol looked at him sideways. The situation. She's protective, he said. She wanted to see what I was building here, whether it was real. A pause. She also wanted to meet you. She came to meet me, Marisol said carefully. He looked at her. I'd mentioned you. The cold air, the sound of the creek, the winter birds in the willows, small and industrious. What did she say? Marisol asked. After. She said. He stopped. He looked out at the land with an expression she couldn't entirely read, which was unusual. She'd gotten better at reading him. She said I looked different than I had in a long time, and that she was glad. Marisol held her coffee cup with both hands and felt warmth that had nothing to do with coffee moving through her. Callum, she said. He looked at her. I think you should know that she stopped, started again. I've been careful, she said, and it came out less smooth than she'd intended, more true. I'm careful about things. It's how I'm built. It's how I've had to be. She looked at him directly because she decided that if she was going to do this, she was going to do it with her eyes open. And I've been less careful lately. About this, she gestured briefly at the space between them. He was very still. I want you to know that, she said. I'm not telling you what to do with it. I just wanted to say it plainly because you say things plainly and I've been not saying it and it was starting to cost me something. The silence lasted a breath, and then 2, and then he stepped closer. Not dramatically, not suddenly, just one step, so that the distance between them changed from the distance of neighbors to something less categorizable, something that existed in the territory where words started to become approximate. Marisol, he said, and the way he said her name was the way it always was, complete, specific, like a sentence. But this time there was something else in it, something that matched what she just said. "Yeah," she said, because she'd run out of words that were more useful than that. He reached out and very carefully, very deliberately, took her free hand. His hand was warm despite the cold morning. He held it in both of his and looked at it for a moment, and then looked at her. "I came here looking for something," he said. "I told you that on the creek. I said I didn't know if I'd found it." He turned her hand slightly in his. "I'd like more time," he said. "I'd like to be less uncertain about it, but I want you to know," he stopped. "I'd like you to know that I'm not uncertain about wanting the time." The morning light came across the valley and touched his face, and she stood in it and held his hand and felt, in the center of her chest, something that had been moving slowly toward the surface for weeks, arriving there, finally, with the unstoppable gentleness of water finding its level. "More time," she said. "Yeah, okay." He smiled then, properly, for the first time since she'd met him, not the corner-of-the-mouth thing, not the restrained warmth she'd been cataloging, but a real smile, full and unguarded, and it changed the quality of his face entirely, made him look younger and less armored and simply, plainly glad. She looked at it and felt something in her chest open like a door in early spring. "Okay," he said. They stood at the fence line in the cold morning with their hands linked, and the creek moving below them and the valley all around them, ordinary and extraordinary in the way that particular moments were. The ones you recognized even while they were happening as belonging to a different category of time, the kind you carried forward. She told her father that evening. Not directly, not with words. She came in from the evening rounds and sat down at the kitchen table where Eduardo was doing his slow, patient reading. He was working through a history of Wyoming homesteading that he'd been reading for 3 months and she suspected would take another 3. And she made tea and sat across from him, and he looked up after a moment and looked at her face and said, with the perceptiveness of someone who had known her every day of her life, "Something happened." "Nothing dramatic," she said. He put down his book. "Tell me the undramatic version." She told him. She kept it simple, factual, the way she handled things. He listened the way he always listened, with his full attention and without interrupting. When she was done, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Your mother would have liked him." She hadn't expected that. It hit her in a place she kept carefully guarded, and she looked at her tea and breathed very steadily. "You think," she said. She liked people who said what they meant, he said. She couldn't stand, he smiled, remembering. She couldn't stand the kind of person who made you guess at everything. She always said, "Just tell me the true thing, the real thing, say it plainly." She'd have liked him. He picked up his book again. "I like him," he added, as if this were a postscript rather than the point. "I know," Marisol said. "The land," he said, not looking up from his page. "It doesn't matter." She looked at him. "His money," he said, "his land. It doesn't change who he is, which is a man who came to our table and listened to an old man talk for 3 hours and never once looked at his phone." He turned a page. "That's the man. The rest is just circumstance." She sat with her tea and the fire and her father's reading, and the ordinary peace of the kitchen and felt, quietly and without drama, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The hard freeze came on a Saturday in late December, 3 days before Christmas, and it came with a severity that the old-timers in the county described as normal, but that felt, in practice, like a sentence. The temperature dropped to 12 below overnight. The creek froze to the bank. The horses' water buckets needed breaking 4 times a day. The old furnace in the ranch house, which Marisol had been nursing through its reluctance for 2 seasons, chose this moment to surrender. She was dealing with the furnace at 9 in the morning, lying on the basement floor with a headlamp and a set of tools and a manual she downloaded 2 years ago against precisely this eventuality, when she heard boots on the kitchen floor above her and her father's voice, and then another voice, lower, accented, familiar, and then Callum Reed was crouching at the top of the basement stairs looking down at her. Heard from Bet you'd lost the heat, he said. She heard from old Hector who saw your father in the parking lot of the hardware store. I brought Jim Parrott. Jim Parrott was, as it turned out, the man on Callum's crew who'd spent 4 years doing HVAC work before transitioning to ranch labor. He had the particular aura of someone who deeply understood mechanical failure in the way of people who'd spent time trying to prevent it. You called Jim Parrott for me, Marisol said from the basement floor. I called Jim Parrott and drove him here, yes. A pause. Will you let him look at it? She looked at her manual, she looked at the furnace, she looked at the stairs. Yeah, she said. Yeah, okay. Jim Parrott fixed the furnace in 40 minutes with parts from Callum's truck and the kind of calm, methodical approach to broken things that Marisol deeply respected. Eduardo made lunch, good, real lunch, the kind that expanded to accommodate extra people with the generosity of people who understood food as care. Callum sat at the kitchen table and helped Marisol untangle the mess of the year-end ledger, because she'd mentioned it offhand once, weeks ago, and he'd apparently retained it, and he had a quiet facility with numbers that she found both useful and slightly unsettling in the way that other people's competencies could be. This line, he said, pointing at a number she'd been avoiding. Your feed costs have doubled since September. I know, she said. Is it the Callaway supplier? Their prices went up. I'm looking at alternatives, she said. There's an outfit in Riverton that's. I buy from a co-op in Laramie, he said. 6 properties in, the price is, he looked at her. I can get you in if you want. She looked at him, she looked at the number, she looked at him again. That would help, she said. He nodded and went back to the ledger. No performance. No keeping score. She looked at the side of his face while he worked and felt something that was protective and warm and complicated, and she looked back at the ledger before he could notice her looking. Later, when Jim had gone and the heat was running and the house was warm again, and Eduardo had retired for the afternoon with his book, Marisol and Callum stood in the kitchen with the last of the lunch coffee and the comfortable quiet that was their specific and private thing. Thank you, she said. For coming, you didn't have to. I know, he said. I mean it, the furnace, the ledger, the... Marisol. He said it the way he always said it, and it stopped her. He looked at her with the full, direct quality of his attention. You're not inconveniencing me. I don't have a scale in my head where I'm measuring what I give against what I get. That's not, he paused. I'm here because I want to be, because this is where I want to be. That's the only reason. She looked at him for a long moment. The kitchen was warm. The light outside was the flat white of a frozen afternoon. Through the window the land was white and still, and the fence lines made dark lines through the snow, and the creek was a silver thread where it caught the winter light. I know, she said, and she meant it fully, which was itself a kind of progress. He was standing close to her in the small kitchen, not planned that way, just the natural geometry of the space, and she was aware of him in the immediate, specific way. She was always aware of him when proximity occurred, the warmth of him, the solidity, the particular quality of his stillness. She looked up at him. He was looking at her with an expression that was quiet and sure and waiting. She took one step forward, closing the remaining space between them, and put her hand against his chest, just over his heart, and felt it beating, quick and unsteady and real. And the expression on his face shifted into something open and undisguised, and he put his hand over hers, and they stood there in the warm kitchen in the winter light and breathed. She lifted her face. He lowered his head. Outside, a wind moved through the frozen willows along the creek, making a sound like something being set gently down. Christmas in Harlow Creek was a modest affair by most standards, and an occasion of genuine warmth by any standard that mattered. The Vega kitchen had a tree that Eduardo had dragged in from the northern edge of their property, as he'd done every year since before Marisol was born, too big for the corner where it went, decorated with ornaments that were old and mismatched and meaningful in the specific way of objects that have survived long enough to carry stories. Marisol made tamales on Christmas Eve, a process she undertook with focused seriousness and a playlist she'd been maintaining since she was 17. And Eduardo made the punch, which was not technically alcoholic, but was something in its proximity to alcoholic that everyone politely didn't examine too closely. Callum appeared at 4 in the afternoon, and he brought his crew, all 6 of them, men who'd been quietly building lives in Harlow Creek alongside their professional presence, men who turned out, in Eduardo's kitchen, to be funny and warm and full of the particular camaraderie of people who worked hard together and liked each other. The kitchen, which had been quiet and a little large for 2 people for a long time, was suddenly loud and warm and full. Marisol stood in the doorway between the kitchen and the living room at one point and watched Callum, her father's hand on his arm, the two of them laughing about something she couldn't hear over the noise, Callum's face fully open, the careful surface entirely gone, and felt something so complete and uncomplicated that she had to look away for a moment, just to breathe. He found her there in the doorway. "You okay?" he said, coming to stand beside her. Close. He was always close to her now with the easy naturalness of someone who decided where they wanted to be and was simply there. "Very," she said. He looked at the room, the noise and warmth of it, the tree, Eduardo laughing, the men who were his people mixing without difficulty with the ordinary specific miracle of a house full of people on a winter night. "I found it," he said. She looked at him, he was looking at her. "The thing I came here looking for," he said. "It was quiet just for her. I found it." She reached out and took his hand. "Yeah," she said, "me too." Outside, the snow was falling again, the slow, patient Wyoming snow that covered everything and softened every edge and made the world, for a few hours, simple and white and still. The creek was frozen solid beneath it. The fence lines disappeared. The boundary between his land and hers vanished under 6 inches of identical white. There were 1,000 things still to figure out. The water rights, the ledger, her father's hands, the way you built something between 2 complicated people who'd each learned through necessity to be self-sufficient in ways that made opening up feel like a structural risk. All of it was still there, real and substantial and unsimplified by love, which was not, she had learned, the kind of thing that made hard things easy. It was the kind of thing that made hard things worth doing. She stood in the doorway with his hand in hers and her father's laughter in the warm kitchen behind her, and the Wyoming winter outside, and felt, with the clarity that arrived when you stopped running from it and simply let it be true, that this was home in a way it hadn't been for years. Not the physical fact of the land, which had always been home, but the emotional fact of it, the sense of being in exactly the right life at exactly the right time. She looked up at Callum Reed, who had come to Wyoming looking for something and had the good sense to stay and look, and she smiled at him, not the careful, calibrated expression she usually presented, but the real one, the open one, the one she kept for very few people and very specific moments. He smiled back. The snow kept falling, slow and thorough, covering everything equally. Not the end. March in Harlow Creek meant mud and possibility. The creek ran fast with snowmelt, brown and urgent and full of itself. The willows turned yellow-green overnight, as if the decision had been made sometime between last Tuesday and this one. The horses stood in the morning sun with the particular satisfaction of animals who have survived winter and know it. The land, which had been white and patient for months, began insisting on itself again. The specific green of new grass, the purple of early wildflowers in the sheltered spots, the smell of earth returning to itself that was one of the finest smells in the world and always arrived as a surprise, as if you'd forgotten it was possible. Marisol was at the fence line when she heard him coming. She didn't turn around. She knew his horse's sound by now, knew the rhythm of Bard's walk, knew the particular quiet before he said anything. She kept her hands on the new wire she was running. This section, at least, they'd agreed would be a real boundary marker, well maintained, the formal acknowledgement of two properties that shared more than a fence. He pulled up beside her. "Morning," he said. "Morning." She finished the connection and straightened up, turned to look at him. He was backlit by the spring sun, the Laramie Range blue and clear behind him, and he was looking at her with that expression she now knew was only for her, the open, direct, certain one, the one that had taken months to fully show itself and was, now that it was there, simply part of the landscape. "The water board confirmed the rights line this morning," he said. "I got the letter." "Good," she pulled off her gloves. "Good, good." He smiled at the three goods. He was always smiling at things like that, the small, specific evidence of her when she was flustered, which was still rare but had become, in his company, somewhat less rare than it used to be. He dismounted, because he always dismounted when they were going to talk. It was one of those things she'd noticed. He didn't talk down to people. He came to their level. "I want to show you something," he said, "at the house, when you have time." A pause. "I had the architects finish the drawings for the East Wing renovation. I want to know what you think." She looked at him. She understood what he was asking, which was not just what she thought of the renovation. "After I finish this section," she said. "I'll wait," he said. He tied Bard to the fence post and sat on the top rail and watched her work, and she worked with the competence and economy she brought to everything. And the spring sun warmed the valley, and the creek ran fast, and somewhere in the willows a pair of yellow warblers announced themselves, with the uncomplicated conviction of animals who knew exactly what the season required. She finished the wire. She pulled on her jacket. She looked at him, sitting on her fence in the morning light, belonging in this landscape as completely and naturally as the hills. "Okay," she said, "let's go." They rode out together toward the Hargrove property, his property, soon to be their possibility, and the valley spread around them in all directions, vast and breathing and indifferent to their smallness and magnificent in the fact of it. And the horses moved easy in the spring mud, and the light was the particular clear light of Wyoming in March, and the land held them as it always had, as it always would. Held them both.